Hello everyone! Welcome to day 1 of the 20-day flower creation journey, a foundation to watercolor flower painting. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio channel. We started this journey by painting these roses from the flower color guidebook. I see that these roses have a round shape and therefore I use a filbert brush in size 8. This is a Princeton Select filbert brush to start creating these roses. I take a little bit of yellow, this is yellow lemon deep, and I start creating this rose from the center. With my filbert brush, I touch the paper with the side or the belly of the brush and I drag from the external part of the petal towards the center. I use the belly, I press, and from the external part, I drag the pigment into the center. I keep adding additional strokes on top of the yellow lemon deep with a darker color. This is yellow ochre. And I keep creating these petals by pressing the brush onto paper and moving the brush towards the center. I remove some of the watercolor and I create different color values in order to give the impression that there are many petals into this flower. The overall shape of this rose is round, therefore I keep going around the center and I keep creating these petals with this small brush, with this filbert brush that has already a round shape in itself. Therefore it really helps to create these petals of this rose. I keep removing some pigment into my cup of water and I use different values, lighter values, in order to create these petals that are toward the outer part of the flower. In the center, I like my flowers to be darker, so when I start the second rose, I start from a darker color, which is yellow ochre. And I use the same technique. I create short and quick strokes to create the center of this rose, and I use the belly of my brush and the side of my brush, and going around the center I create these petals. I remove part of the pigment into the cup of water, and with a lighter value of this color I keep creating additional petals all around the center of the second rose. I keep in mind what is the shape, the overall shape of this flower, and the impression that I want to give in this painting is that this flower has many petals. With the yellow ochre, I go back to the first rose I painted and I keep adding a little bit of contrast in the center and onto some of the petals that are towards the outer part. And I do the same on the second flower as well. I just touch a little bit, I do not put a lot of pressure onto these petals, and through the wet on wet technique, the bleeding of the yellow ochre onto the yellow lemon deep will be beautiful when the composition will be completely dry. I started to create the third flower following the book that I have on my left, and this is just a small bud where I decided to add a little bit of darker color, in this case a little bit of magenta, because I noticed that the picture has a darker area in the center. So now I proceed creating the fourth rose on top of the paper, and I use the belly and the side of my filbert brush to create these petals. These roses have a lot of petals, so with this composition and with this tutorial, I want you to try to use your filbert brush or whatever brush you're using, creating short strokes and quick ones to create these petals. I add some contrast, adding some darker color in the center of this rose. When I'm looking at a reference picture, I use this as a reference, as I say, but then I follow my imagination and I follow my artistic intuition to add some elements that might fit into the composition or that I just like to paint. So remember that when you are painting, looking at a reference picture, you are still the owner of your painting and you can do whatever you want and give a different spin compared to what you see on the reference picture. At this point, the roses are ready and I decide to add the stems, which in the picture I see are in dark brown. I started to create these stems with a filbert brush, and in order to create them quite thin, I use the side of the brush to create these strokes. I am quite pleased, but I decided to use then the mop brush in order to create a more continuous line and to define better the stems of these flowers. I'm using burnt umber to create the stems, and then with the same brush, this mop brush, I started to create the leaves. To create the leaves, I just use a little bit of sap green and I create them in very loose style by pressing the belly of this mop brush onto paper and then dragging until the point touches the paper. I use a mixture of sap green and brown to create darker leaves. The brown is burnt umber. And then to create leaves that are different in color, I add, for example, a little bit of yellow lemon dip in order to create a green that is brighter and more vibrant. As I proceed creating these leaves, I keep an eye to my reference picture, but basically I decide where to place these leaves. I do not follow exactly the reference picture to understand where to put these leaves because I want basically to have fun and I want to enjoy this process. So I just look at the picture and I understand that these roses have a lot of round shaped leaves, small in size, and this is what I'm trying to reproduce. With my brush, I touch the paper to create these leaves all around the flowers, but basically I play with the colors and with my brush in order to create these elements in the composition all around the yellow flowers. I take care to create leaves that are framing these flowers, that are dancing around these flowers all over the paper. But I do not stress to create something that is necessarily identical to what I see. Since this composition is very heavy in leaves, or this is at least what I am trying to recreate, I want to give you a tip on how to make your compositions that are heavy on one detail very interesting for the observer to see. My tip for you is to change the color value of the element you're creating. In this case, for example, we are creating a lot of leaves that are mainly in green color. Therefore, you can change the color in itself by adding a little bit of brown, a little bit of yellow, or a little bit of blue to create different colors of green. But remember especially to remove a part of the pigment into the cup of water to create lighter values of the colors you're using, and in this way your composition will become super interesting to look at. The final touch that I always add in all of my compositions, and this is also something that I want to give you as a tip, is to add some contrasting elements. In this case, for example, I'm adding darker leaves, and I do this by mixing sap green, for example, with a blue or with a purple. In this way, these elements are really going to pop up and the composition is going to be really completed. I usually like to add these details at the end when I have an overall look of what I have painted so far and I can understand better where to add these elements. I use the tip of my brush to create very little strokes that in this case are leaves. At this point, with the tip of this mop brush, I just mix a little bit of yellow ochre and yellow lemon dip to create a little bit of texture in the middle of these flowers. With very little pressure and just touching the paper with the very tip of this brush, I create very fine lines to remark where the petals are. I do this looking at the reference picture. I understand that in the center there are a lot of many little petals, and therefore I add more strokes towards the center of the roses I've created to give the impression that the center part of these flowers is filled with little petals. I change the color that I'm using to create these fine lines. Sometimes it's a darker shade of yellow, sometimes it's a lighter shade of yellow. I honestly follow my intuition and I just add these lines where I feel as an artist that they should be placed. At this point, this composition is completed. I really hope you enjoyed painting with me or just watching this video and following along. I hope to see you on day 2 of the 20-day flower creation journey.